I thought it would be fun to run over a brief history of the major audio formats that have been in use since the beginning of the recording industry. I'll clarify right at the beginning that formats that were used in recording studios are a little bit different than the formats that music consumers have typically purchased, mostly because of the size of the machines. And so these are mostly consumer products that I'll be telling you about. Gramophones were invented in the late 1800s. They first played cylinders and then played flat shellac 78s by the early 1900s. It may be that in your grandmother's house you can still find 78 records. They are the ones that are actually breakable. You might have seen old black and white comedy films where they're breaking shellac 78s over each other's heads. Very different than the vinyl that was used in later years. They still sound really great if you can find a turntable that will play them. Radio, believe it or not, was not invented and really, used in any kind of broad way until the 1920s. Radio, of course, is not a storage format that is sold to consumers, but was a very important part of consumer trends, particularly during the Depression. There was a heyday of record making in the 1920s that really kind of shrank in the 1930s in the United States because of the Great Depression, and radio was an important part of dictating and responding to consumers during those tough economic times. Reel-to-reel tape was also developed in the 1930s. It was something that was used in some homes, particularly among people who really loved music and were sort of audiophiles themselves. And of course, reel-to-reel tape was a very important part of recording, both in half-inch and 4-track, 8-track, 16-track, 2-inch tape kinds of models later on. Vinyl records were developed in the 1940s. When we talk about vinyl, we usually mean 12-inch LPs, but vinyl also refers to 45s. The 12-inch LPs, of course, have two sides, typically with maybe 4 or 5 pop songs on each side. 45s are singles. There is one song on one side and another song on the other side, side B. 8-track tapes were developed and came into broad usage in the 1960s and in the 1970s. They were particularly beloved on car trips. A lot of automobiles in the States during that time had 8-track tape players. They are a kind of nostalgia piece now. You can find them in yard sales and so forth, but a lot of people who grew up during that era have very fond memories of 8-track tapes. Cassettes came into broad usage starting in the 1970s, but then really boomed in the 1980s. With the advent of portable cassette players like the Sony Walkman and boom boxes, that was a real kind of change for the way that people consume music. The fact that you could take it with you anywhere was a new concept in the early part of the 1980s and really changed the way that people traveled with music and consumed music on the go. It's also very important in the early history of hip-hop, too. Stick a boombox on the corner and show everybody what you can do. In the early 1980s, CDs started being used. It was the first broadly used digital format and were very successful for a long time. A lot of people bought CDs. A lot of people still have CDs. And a lot of people will argue that the sound of CDs is still the best that you can get for certain kinds of things. But as I'm sure all of you know, sales of CDs have really been going down recently because of the advent of digital media like MP3s. MP3s were first sort of seen in the late 1990s and, of course, have become more and more popular in the years since then. We'll be talking more about streaming media and whether or not, recorded, physical, or digital ownership of music is even something that we're going to see moving forward. But I wanted to mention, too, that with a lot of these formats that I've told you about, particularly with vinyl and now even with cassette tapes, there is a real kind of emotional attachment to these formats. There are a lot of very smart people who know a lot about music who will tell you that vinyl is still the best sound that you'll ever hear. If you have a great, tube amplifier system with some good speakers and you've got a nice piece of vinyl and you play music that way, that there's no better experience of music than listening to it that way. And I have to admit that I love the sound of vinyl myself. There's also a trend that I'm sure a lot of you are aware of a kind of nostalgia for cassette tapes, and particularly mixtapes. I find this to be really interesting. I mean, I don't think anyone would argue necessarily that the audio quality of cassettes is the best that there has ever been, but there's something very personal about the idea of making a mixtape for somebody and giving it to them as a gift. And people of a certain age, have fond memories of cassette tapes as well. There's a kind of resurgence among indie rockers in particular with cassette tapes. They were also a really important part of heavy metal history, by the way. Sound quality varies a lot among these different kinds of formats, and the choices that you make in terms of what kind of format you want to listen to are really very personal. Maybe you can't stand the sound of scratches on vinyl. Maybe you love the compression that you can find on MP3s. Maybe you like the high fidelity and durability of your CD collection. It's really up to you, but I think that for any music fan, it's worth checking out your favorite music in several different formats just to learn how great the variation can be.